The scorching Arizona sun beat down mercilessly as Hannah Morrison fled across the dry, cracked earth, her breath coming in desperate gasps and her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. Behind her, the sounds of pursuit grew louder, the angry shouts of Silas Blackstone, the man who had purchased her from her stepfather in a drunken bargain just hours before. The year was 1876, and in this unforgiving territory, a woman's freedom could be traded away like cattle. Hannah's lungs burned as she ran, her simple cotton dress torn at the hem from catching on sagebrush. She had escaped when Blackstone had stopped his wagon to water the horses, slipping away when his back was turned. The bruises on her wrists where he had bound her still throbbed, a reminder of what awaited her if she was caught. "You can't run from me, girl." Blackstone's voice boomed across the barren landscape. "Your pa made a deal, and I aim to collect." Hannah didn't look back. Her stepfather was no kin of hers in any way that mattered, and his gambling debts were not her burden to bear, especially not with her body and her future. She pushed herself harder, though her legs trembled with exhaustion and her throat felt lined with sand. The sound of hoofbeats approaching from another direction made her heart sink. She was trapped between pursuers now. As she crested a small rise, Hannah glanced over her shoulder to see Blackstone gaining on her, his face twisted with rage. When she turned forward again, she nearly collided with a rider who had appeared before her. Atop a magnificent chestnut stallion sat a tall man with sun-bronzed skin and eyes the color of a summer storm. He wore a worn leather vest over a faded blue shirt, and a Stetson hat shaded his face. A cowboy, and by the look of him, one who knew the territory well. "Please," Hannah gasped, reaching up toward him. "Help me." The cowboy's eyes narrowed as they flicked from her to Blackstone, who was now close enough that Hannah could hear his labored breathing. "She's mine," Blackstone shouted. "Stay out of this, stranger." The cowboy didn't speak. In one fluid motion, he leaned down and extended his arm. Hannah grasped it, and with surprising strength, he pulled her up and onto his horse, settling her in front of him. "What do you think you're doing?" Blackstone had drawn a pistol now, his face mottled with rage. "That woman is my property." The cowboy's arm tightened around Hannah's waist, and she felt the solid warmth of his chest against her back. "No woman is property," he said, his voice low and steady. Then he spurred his horse, and they were off, galloping across the desert floor with Blackstone's curses fading behind them. Hannah clung to the saddle horn, the wind whipping her auburn hair as they rode. She didn't know this man, didn't know if she had just exchanged one danger for another, but something in the gentle firmness of his hold told her she could trust him at least for now. "Thank you," she managed to say over the thundering of hooves. "My name is Hannah Morrison." The cowboy didn't slow their pace, his eyes scanning the horizon for signs of pursuit. "Rylan Garrett," he replied. "And you're welcome, Miss Morrison, though we're not out of trouble yet." They rode for what seemed like hours, the landscape changing from flat desert to rocky terrain dotted with scrub brush and the occasional stunted tree. Finally, as the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple, Rylan guided his horse toward a narrow canyon. "We'll rest here for the night," he said, dismounting smoothly before helping Hannah down. Her legs nearly buckled beneath her, stiff from the long ride and weak from fear and exhaustion. Rylan steadied her with strong hands. "Easy there," he said, his voice gentler than before. Up close, Hannah could see the fine lines around his eyes that spoke of years squinting against the sun, and the way his dark hair curled slightly at the nape of his neck. "Why did you help me?" Hannah asked, needing to understand the motivations of this stranger who had risked himself for her. Rylan busied himself with unsaddling his horse. "I've seen men like Blackstone before," he said, his jaw tightening. "Men who think they can own people. No one deserves that fate." He worked efficiently, setting up a small camp in a protected area of the canyon. From his saddlebags, he produced jerky and hardtack, offering some to Hannah, who suddenly realized she was famished. As they sat by a small, carefully built fire, Hannah told him about her stepfather's gambling and drinking, how he had lost everything after her mother died, and finally, how he had wagered Hannah herself in a poker game with Silas Blackstone. "I woke this morning to find him packing my things," she said, staring into the flames. "He told me I belonged to Blackstone now, that the man was taking me to his ranch in New Mexico territory as his wife. She spat the last word, unable to mask her disgust. Rylan's eyes darkened. That's no marriage. That's slavery. Hannah nodded, wrapping her arms around herself against the chill that had nothing to do with the desert night. I managed to escape when we stopped at a creek, but he was close behind me. If you hadn't come along. She couldn't finish the thought. Where were you headed? Rylan asked, poking at the fire with a stick. Hannah gave a small, bitter laugh. Nowhere. Anywhere. I just knew I had to get away. She looked up at him, really studying his face for the first time. There was a steadiness to him, a quiet confidence that spoke of a man who had faced hardship and emerged stronger. What about you? Where were you going before you found me? Tucson, he replied. I've got business there. Oh. Hannah felt a sinking feeling. I've delayed you then. Rylan shrugged. It'll keep. He looked at her thoughtfully. Do you have family somewhere? Anyone who could take you in? Hannah shook her head. No one. My mother was my only real family, and she's been gone 2 years now. She hesitated. I was a schoolteacher back in Texas, before my stepfather moved us out here. I could find work doing that again, I suppose. Tucson's growing fast, Rylan said. They might need teachers. He didn't make any promises, but Hannah felt a glimmer of hope for the first time since her world had collapsed that morning. As the fire died down to embers, Rylan gave Hannah his bedroll. Get some sleep, he said. We'll head out at first light. Blackstone doesn't strike me as the type to give up easily. Hannah wanted to protest, to offer to take turns sleeping on the ground, but exhaustion overwhelmed her. As she drifted off, she was vaguely aware of Rylan sitting against a boulder, his rifle across his knees, watching over her. She woke to the soft golden light of dawn and the smell of coffee. Rylan was already up, tending to his horse and preparing for their departure. When he noticed she was awake, he handed her a tin cup of strong, bitter coffee. Thank you, she said, sitting up and trying to smooth her tangled hair. For everything. Rylan nodded, his expression unreadable. We should get moving. It's a long ride to Tucson, and I'd rather not have company. They packed up quickly, erasing all signs of their camp. As Rylan helped Hannah onto his horse, she was acutely aware of his hands at her waist, strong and respectful. She settled in front of him again, and they set off, following a trail that wound through the canyon before opening onto a vast plain. The day grew hot as they rode, the sun climbing relentlessly in a cloudless sky. Rylan kept them moving at a steady pace, occasionally stopping to rest the horse and scan their back trail. There was no sign of pursuit, but Hannah could tell he remained vigilant. How did you come to be a cowboy? She asked during one of these breaks, curious about this man who had so dramatically altered the course of her life. Rylan took a drink from his canteen before answering. I was born to it, I suppose. My father ran cattle in West Texas. When he died, I worked ranches all over Texas, New Mexico, Arizona. A shadow crossed his face. Then the war came. Hannah nodded, understanding. The Civil War had touched everyone, reshaped the nation in ways still being felt a decade later. I served with the Texas Cavalry, Rylan continued, his voice distant. Came back to find our ranch gone, taken for taxes. My mother had died while I was away. He shrugged, as if dismissing the old pain. So I went back to what I knew. Been driving cattle and doing odd jobs since. I'm sorry, Hannah said softly. About your family. Rylan met her eyes then, and something passed between them, a recognition of shared loss, perhaps. It was a long time ago. He stood, adjusting his hat. We should keep moving. As they rode through the afternoon, Hannah found herself becoming more aware of Rylan, the steady rhythm of his breathing, the way he held himself, alert but relaxed. There was something comforting about his presence, a sense that whatever came, he would face it head-on. The sun was low in the sky when they came to a small stream. Rylan drew his horse to a halt. We'll make camp here for the night, he said, dismounting and helping Hannah down. As they set up camp, Hannah noticed Rylan wincing slightly when he lifted his saddle. Are you hurt? She asked, stepping closer. He shook his head. Old wound. Acts up sometimes. Let me see, Hannah said, her teacher's voice automatically asserting itself. Rylan looked surprised, then amused. Yes, madam, he said, a hint of a smile touching his lips. He unbuttoned his shirt enough to show her his right shoulder, where an ugly scar puckered the skin. Mini ball, he explained. Shiloh. Hannah's fingers hovered over the scar, not quite touching. It never healed properly. Army surgeon had more patience than time, Rylan said, rebuttoning his shirt. I was lucky. Many weren't. Hannah nodded soberly, thinking of the thousands who hadn't come home. I can help with the camp, she offered, changing the subject. Together they gathered firewood and prepared a simple meal. As night fell, they sat side by side, watching the flames and talking quietly. Hannah told him about her childhood in Boston, her father's death when she was young, and her mother's remarriage to the man who would eventually gamble away their future. I loved teaching, she said, nostalgia warming her voice. The children, their faces when they understood something new. There's nothing like it. Rylan listened attentively, asking questions that showed he was genuinely interested. Hannah found herself speaking more freely than she had in years, the words flowing easily between them. When she finally yawned, unable to keep her eyes open any longer, Rylan again insisted she take the bedroll. This time, Hannah was too tired to argue, but as she drifted off to sleep, she was aware of him settling nearby, a steadfast guardian in the darkness. Morning came with an unwelcome surprise. Hannah was awakened by Rylan's hand over her mouth, his finger to his lips signaling silence. When she nodded her understanding, he removed his hand and gestured for her to stay down. In the distance, Hannah could hear voices and the clinking of tack. Rylan moved silently to the edge of their small camp, peering cautiously around a large boulder. When he returned to her side, his expression was grim. Blackstone, he whispered, and he's brought friends. Fear clutched at Hannah's heart. How many? 3 that I can see. They're following our trail. Rylan was already gathering their belongings, moving with quiet efficiency. We need to go? Now. They doused the remnants of their fire with dirt and packed up, leaving as little sign of their presence as possible. Rylan led his horse by the reins until they were well away from the camp, then helped Hannah up before mounting behind her. Hold tight, he murmured, and urged the horse into a gallop. They rode hard across the open plain, heading for a line of low hills in the distance. Hannah could feel the tension in Rylan's body, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. The morning air was cool against her face, but fear kept her warm, and the heat of Rylan's chest pressed against her back. As they reached the hills, Rylan guided them into a maze of rocky outcroppings and narrow passes. The going was slower here, but the terrain offered cover and made their trail harder to follow. Still, Hannah knew that Blackstone wouldn't give up easily. The man had paid for her, and in his mind, she was his property, stolen by Rylan. They rode through the morning and into the afternoon, stopping only briefly to rest the horse and drink from their dwindling water supply. Hannah's body ached from the punishing pace, but she didn't complain. Every mile put distance between them and Blackstone, bringing her closer to a chance at freedom. As the sun began its descent, they emerged from the hills onto a flat, barren expanse dotted with saguaro cacti. In the distance, Hannah could make out a cluster of buildings shimmering in the heat haze. What is that? She asked, squinting against the glare. Way station, Rylan replied. Last stop before Tucson. Relief flooded through Hannah. Civilization meant safety, or at least witnesses if Blackstone caught up to them. They rode toward the station, the horse picking up its pace, as if sensing the prospect of rest and water. The way station was a rough collection of buildings, a main house, a stable, and a few outbuildings surrounded by a wooden fence. As they approached, a man emerged from the main house, shading his eyes against the setting sun. Hail the station, Rylan called. Hail yourself, the man replied, lowering his hand as they drew closer. He was older, with a grizzled beard and weathered skin that spoke of decades in the harsh desert climate. Name's Burke. What brings you folks out this way? Headed to Tucson, Rylan said, dismounting and helping Hannah down. Need a place to rest for the night. And water for my horse. Burke's eyes moved from Rylan to Hannah, taking in her disheveled appearance and the way she stood close to Rylan. Wife? He asked bluntly. Before Rylan could respond, Hannah stepped forward. Yes, she said firmly. I'm Mrs. Garrett. She felt Rylan's surprise, but didn't look at him. Better for Burke to think they were married than to question why a single woman was traveling alone with a man. And if Blackstone came asking, Burke would be less likely to give them away if he believed they were a legitimate couple. Burke nodded, seemingly satisfied. Well, Mr. and Mrs. Garrett, you're welcome to stay. 2 bits for the room, includes supper. Stable your horse for another 2. Rylan paid him, and Burke gestured toward the stable. Get your horse settled, then come on in. The missus has stew on. As Burke walked back to the house, Rylan turned to Hannah, one eyebrow raised in question. Hannah felt heat rise to her cheeks. I thought it would be safer, she explained. If he thinks we're married. A hint of a smile played at the corners of Rylan's mouth. Mrs. Garrett, is it? Just for tonight, Hannah said, embarrassed now. It seemed the simplest explanation. Rylan nodded, his expression softening. It was quick thinking. And you're right, it's safer. They walked to the stable together, where Rylan tended to his horse while Hannah waited, still feeling flustered by her impulsive lie. She wasn't entirely sure why it had affected her so strongly. It was just a practical measure, after all. But hearing herself called Mrs. Garrett had stirred something unexpected within her. The stable was cool and shadowy, smelling of hay and horses. As Rylan worked, Hannah wandered to the open doorway, looking back the way they had come. The vast desert stretched to the horizon, empty and still. No sign of pursuit, but that didn't mean Blackstone wasn't out there somewhere, following their trail. Do you think we lost them? She asked as Rylan joined her. He followed her gaze. For now, maybe. But a man like that, with pride and money at stake. He shook his head. He'll keep looking. Hannah sighed, wrapping her arms around herself. I'm sorry to have brought this trouble to you. Rylan turned to her, his gray eyes serious. You didn't bring anything to me, Hannah. I chose to help you. I don't regret it. The simple sincerity in his voice touched her deeply. Here was a man who had already faced so much hardship in his life, yet he had willingly taken on her troubles as well. Thank you, she said softly, for choosing to help me. Something passed between them then, a current of understanding that went beyond words. For a moment, Hannah thought Rylan might say more, or perhaps even reach for her. But then he cleared his throat and gestured toward the main house. We should get some supper, he said. Tomorrow will be another long day. The main house was simply furnished but clean, with a large common room where a few other travelers sat at a long table. Mrs. Burke, a stout woman with kind eyes and capable hands, served them bowls of hearty beef stew and thick slices of freshly baked bread. Hannah ate gratefully, suddenly aware of how hungry she was. The other travelers, a pair of freight drivers and a salesman, paid them little attention, more interested in their food and their own conversation. After supper, Mrs. Burke showed them to a small room at the back of the house. It contained a bed, a washstand with a pitcher of water and a basin, and a wooden chair. When the door closed behind her, Hannah and Rylan looked at each other, both suddenly aware of the intimacy of their situation. I'll take the floor, Rylan said immediately. You don't have to, Hannah replied, then flushed when she realized how her words might be interpreted. I mean, we could share the bed. Just to sleep. Her face grew hotter. You've already spent 2 nights on the ground because of me. Rylan's expression was unreadable. It wouldn't be proper. Hannah couldn't help but laugh. Mr. Garrett, we've been riding together for 2 days, with me practically in your lap. I think propriety is already compromised. A slow smile spread across Rylan's face. You might have a point there, Mrs. Garrett. The use of the false name made them both laugh, breaking the tension. They took turns using the wash basin, and Hannah felt immeasurably better after washing the dust of travel from her face and hands. When it came time to sleep, they both lay stiffly on opposite sides of the narrow bed, careful not to touch. Despite her exhaustion, Hannah found it hard to fall asleep, acutely aware of Rylan's presence beside her. His breathing eventually deepened and steadied, but Hannah remained awake, staring at the shadows on the ceiling. She thought about the strange turn her life had taken. 2 days ago, she had been forced to leave her home with a man who saw her as property. Now she was sharing a bed chastely, but still sharing with a man who had risked himself to save her. A man whose strength and kindness had begun to affect her in ways she hadn't expected. Hannah finally drifted off to sleep with these thoughts swirling in her mind. Her dreams were a confused jumble of running and riding, of Blackstone's angry face and Rylan's steady presence. She woke with a start when a hand gently shook her shoulder. Hannah, Rylan whispered. We need to go. The room was still dark, the first faint light of dawn barely visible through the small window. Hannah sat up, instantly alert. What's wrong? Riders coming in. Could be nothing, but I don't want to take chances. Rylan was already dressed, his saddlebags packed. Hannah quickly rose and put on her shoes, smoothing her dress as best she could. They slipped out of the room and through the silent house, making their way to the stable. Rylan saddled his horse while Hannah kept watch at the door. The eastern sky was just beginning to lighten as they rode away from the way station, heading west rather than continuing south toward Tucson. Hannah understood without being told Rylan was changing their route to throw off pursuit. They rode in silence until the way station was far behind them and the sun had fully risen. Rylan finally slowed their pace, allowing the horse to walk. He seemed tense, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. Do you think it was them? Hannah asked. Rylan nodded grimly. 4 riders, coming from the east. Same direction we came from. Could be coincidence, but you don't believe in coincidences, Hannah finished for him. Not in my experience. He looked at her apologetically. It means a longer journey to Tucson. We'll have to circle around, use the terrain to hide our trail. Hannah nodded, trying to hide her disappointment. She had hoped they were nearly free of Blackstone's pursuit. How much longer? A day, maybe 2. Rylan's expression softened. I'm sorry, Hannah. I know you're eager to reach safety. It's not your fault, she assured him. You've already done so much for me. More than I had any right to expect from a stranger. Rylan was quiet for a moment. Don't feel like a stranger anymore, he said finally, his voice low. Hannah's heart quickened at his words. No, she agreed softly. You don't. They rode throughout the day, following a winding path through increasingly rugged terrain. Rylan seemed to know the land well, navigating with confidence even when there was no visible trail. By late afternoon, they had reached a series of rocky bluffs overlooking a broad valley. We'll camp up here tonight, Rylan said, indicating a sheltered spot between 2 large boulders. Good visibility in all directions. As they made camp, Hannah noticed Rylan was quieter than usual, his movements tense. She wondered if he was worried about Blackstone, or if perhaps their night at the way station had made him uncomfortable. The thought that he might be regretting his decision to help her made her chest ache. They ate a simple meal of jerky and the last of the bread Mrs. Burke had given them. As darkness fell, the temperature dropped rapidly, the desert night bringing a chill that seeped through Hannah's thin dress. Rylan noticed her shivering. Without a word, he removed his leather vest and draped it around her shoulders. The garment was still warm from his body, and it carried his scent leather and horses and something uniquely him. Thank you, Hannah said, pulling it close around her. Rylan nodded, poking at their small fire. The flames cast flickering shadows across his face, highlighting the strong line of his jaw and the thoughtful set of his mouth. Hannah found herself studying him, noticing details she hadn't before: the small scar at his temple, the way his hair curled slightly where it touched his collar, the capable strength of his hands. What will you do in Tucson? Rylan asked suddenly, breaking the silence. Hannah considered the question. Find work, I hope. As I said, I was a teacher before. Perhaps there's a school that needs help. She paused. And you? You mentioned you had business there. Rylan nodded. A cattle buyer. I've been hired to drive a herd from a ranch outside Tucson up to Santa Fe. Oh, Hannah tried to hide her disappointment. Somehow, she had begun to imagine a future where Rylan remained part of her life. That sounds like a long journey. It is. 2 months, at least. He looked up at her then, his eyes reflecting the firelight. But I'll be coming back this way afterward. To Tucson. Hannah felt a flutter of hope. Will you? Rylan held her gaze. I thought I might, if there was a reason to return. The meaning behind his words was clear, and Hannah's heart began to race. There might be, she said softly. A reason. Something shifted in Rylan's expression, a softening around his eyes. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could, a sound in the distance made them both freeze. Voices. Faint but distinct. Rylan was on his feet in an instant, stamping out their fire. Get your things, he whispered urgently. Quickly. Hannah scrambled to obey, her hands shaking. In moments, they had packed up their meager camp and were leading the horse deeper into the rocks, away from the voices. The moon was nearly full, providing enough light to navigate, but also making it easier for them to be spotted. They moved as silently as possible, Rylan leading the way through a narrow defile between towering rock formations. Hannah could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears, fear making her stomach clench. Behind them, the voices grew fainter, then disappeared altogether. After what seemed like hours, Rylan finally stopped. They had reached a small box canyon, its walls rising steeply on three sides. A trickle of water ran down one rock face, forming a tiny pool at the bottom before disappearing into the sand. "We should be safe here for the night," Rylan said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The entrance is narrow, easy to defend if needed." Hannah nodded, still too frightened to speak. She sank down onto a flat rock, suddenly exhausted. Rylan secured the horse, then came to sit beside her. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I thought we'd lost them." Hannah shook her head. "It's not your fault. You've done everything possible to keep me safe." She looked up at him, her eyes shining in the moonlight. "Why? Why risk so much for someone you don't even know?" Rylan was silent for a long moment, looking out at the silver-washed landscape. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and intense. "During the war, I saw the worst men can do to each other. The cruelty, the disregard for human life." He turned to her. "When I came back, I promised myself I'd never stand by and watch someone suffer if I could help. Not ever again." Hannah's throat tightened with emotion. She reached out impulsively and took his hand. "You're a good man, Rylan Garrett." His fingers curled around hers. "I try to be." They sat like that for some time, hands joined, surrounded by the vast silence of the desert night. Eventually, exhaustion overcame Hannah, and she found herself leaning against Rylan's shoulder, her eyes growing heavy. "You should rest," he murmured, his breath warm against her hair. Hannah nodded sleepily. "What about you?" "I'll keep watch for a while." He helped her arrange her bedroll in a sheltered spot, then sat nearby, his rifle across his knees. Despite her fear and the hard ground beneath her, Hannah fell asleep quickly, comforted by Rylan's presence. Her last conscious thought was a prayer that they would reach Tucson safely and that whatever was growing between her and this quiet, honorable cowboy would have a chance to flourish. She woke to the soft gray light of pre-dawn and the sensation of being watched. Opening her eyes, she found Rylan sitting where she had left him, his gaze on her face. When he saw she was awake, he smiled, a real smile that transformed his serious features and made her heart skip a beat. "Good morning," he said softly. Hannah sat up, brushing hair from her face. "Did you sleep at all?" "Some." He stood and offered her his hand, pulling her to her feet. "We should get moving. I want to be well away from here before full light." They ate a hasty breakfast of jerky and water from the small pool, then packed up and led the horse out of the canyon. The eastern sky was streaked with pink and gold as they emerged, the air still cool, but promising another hot day ahead. Rylan helped Hannah onto the horse, then mounted behind her. They set off at a steady pace, winding their way through the rocky landscape. Hannah was acutely aware of Rylan's arms around her, his chest solid against her back. The danger they faced had somehow intensified the connection between them, making every touch, every shared glance, more meaningful. As the sun climbed higher, they left the rocks behind and entered a vast desert plain. Rylan kept them moving at a good pace, the horse's hooves kicking up small clouds of dust. In the distance, heat waves shimmered above the sand, distorting the horizon. "How far to Tucson now?" Hannah asked during a brief stop to rest the horse. "If we keep this pace, we should reach it by tomorrow afternoon," Rylan replied, scanning their back trail with narrowed eyes. No sign of pursuit so far today. Hannah felt a surge of hope. Perhaps they had finally lost Blackstone. "That's good news." Rylan nodded, but his expression remained vigilant. "Don't let your guard down yet. We're still in open country." They mounted up again and continued south, the sun beating down mercilessly. Hannah's skin felt tight and hot despite the protection of Rylan's vest, which he had insisted she continue wearing. Her throat was parched, and she rationed her sips from the canteen, knowing they needed to make the water last. As the day wore on, the landscape began to change subtly. Stands of Palo Verde trees appeared, their green trunks and branches providing welcome splashes of color. Saguaro cacti grew more numerous, their tall forms reaching toward the sky like sentinels. By late afternoon, They had reached a small stream lined with cottonwood trees. Rylan drew the horse to a halt in the shade, and they both dismounted gratefully. While the horse drank deeply, Hannah splashed cool water on her face and arms, sighing with relief. Rylan filled their canteens, then sat beside her on a fallen log. "We'll rest here until dusk, then ride through the night," he said. "It's cooler and will be harder to spot." Hannah nodded, too exhausted to argue. The past few days had taken a toll on her body and her spirit. She leaned back against a tree trunk, closing her eyes. The sound of the stream and the rustle of leaves overhead was soothing, almost hypnotic. "Hannah," Rylan's voice was soft but urgent. "Hannah, wake up." She opened her eyes, disoriented. The light had changed. The sun was lower now, casting long shadows across the ground. "I'm sorry," she murmured. "I must have dozed off." "It's all right. You needed the rest." Rylan was crouched beside her, his expression tense. "But we need to move. Now." Hannah was instantly alert. "What's wrong?" "Dust cloud to the north. Riders coming this way." He helped her to her feet. "Might not be Blackstone, but I don't want to find out." They hurried to where the horse was tethered. Rylan helped Hannah mount, then swung up behind her. They set off at a gallop, following the course of the stream southward. The horse's hooves thundered on the hard-packed earth, and Hannah clung to the saddle horn, her heart racing with fear and exhilaration. They rode hard for several miles, putting distance between themselves and the approaching riders. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Rylan finally slowed their pace, allowing the horse to catch its breath. The desert around them was transformed by the twilight, the harsh landscape softening into shades of purple and blue. "Do you think we lost them?" Hannah asked, her voice breathless from the wild ride. Rylan turned to look back the way they had come. "For now, but they'll be following our trail. We need to find a way to throw them off." As if in answer to his words, they crested a rise and saw before them a wide, shallow river, its waters glinting in the fading light. Rylan urged the horse forward, into the water. "We'll follow the river for a while," he explained. "Water doesn't hold tracks." They rode downstream, the horse splashing through the gentle current. The river curved and twisted through the landscape, its banks lined with rushes and occasional trees. As darkness fell completely, stars appeared overhead, a dazzling array of lights in the velvet sky. Hannah found herself leaning back against Rylan, fatigue making her muscles ache. His arm tightened around her waist, steadying her. "Hold on," he murmured against her hair. "Not much farther now." They traveled through the night, following the river for several miles before turning south again across open country. The moon provided enough light to navigate, but Rylan kept their pace slower now, mindful of the tired horse and the uneven terrain. Hannah drifted in and out of sleep, lulled by the rhythmic motion of the horse and the warmth of Rylan's body behind her. She dreamed of a small house with a garden, of children laughing, of Rylan smiling at her across a kitchen table. The dreams were so vivid that when she fully woke, with the first light of dawn breaking over the eastern horizon, she felt a sense of loss. The landscape around them had changed dramatically. They were riding through a valley now, with mountains rising on either side. Ahead, Hannah could make out cultivated fields and the scattered buildings of outlying farms. Beyond them, nestled against the base of a mountain range, lay a town Tucson. "We made it," she breathed, hardly daring to believe they had finally reached safety. Rylan's arm tightened around her waist. "Almost," he cautioned. "Let's not celebrate just yet." They continued toward the town, passing farms where workers were already in the fields despite the early hour. A wagon loaded with produce rumbled past them on the road, the driver touching his hat in greeting. Hannah felt a surge of relief at these signs of normal, peaceful life after days of desperate flight. As they approached the outskirts of Tucson, Rylan guided them toward a modest building set back from the main road. A sign hanging from the porch identified it as Miller's Boarding House. "The owner is an old friend," Rylan explained as he helped Hannah dismount. "You'll be safe here while I take care of my business." Hannah's heart sank at the reminder that their paths would soon diverge. She had grown so accustomed to Rylan's presence, to the feeling of security he provided, that the thought of being without him was unexpectedly painful. A plump, gray-haired woman emerged from the house as they approached, her face lighting up with recognition. "Rylan Garrett." as I live and breathe. Hello, Mrs. Miller, Rylan said, smiling warmly. It's good to see you. And who's this you've brought with you? Mrs. Miller asked, her kind eyes taking in Hannah's disheveled appearance. This is Miss Hannah Morrison, Rylan said. She's looking for a safe place to stay while she finds work in town. I was hoping you might have a room available. Of course, dear, Mrs. Miller said, beckoning Hannah forward. Any friend of Rylan's is welcome here. Hannah turned to Rylan, suddenly reluctant to part from him. When will I see you again? His eyes softened as they met hers. I need to meet with the cattle buyer today, then prepare for the drive north. It will take a few days. He hesitated, then added, I'll come by when I can. It wasn't the reassurance Hannah had hoped for, but she nodded bravely. Thank you, Rylan, for everything. Mrs. Miller had tactfully moved a few steps away, giving them a moment of privacy. Rylan took Hannah's hand, his thumb brushing across her knuckles in a gentle caress. Take care of yourself, Hannah Morrison, he said softly. Then he was gone, leading his horse down the street toward the center of town. Hannah watched him go, a complex mixture of emotions swirling within her: gratitude, admiration, and something deeper that she wasn't quite ready to name. Mrs. Miller showed Hannah to a small but clean room on the second floor. The washroom is down the hall, she explained. Meals are served in the dining room: breakfast at 7, dinner at noon, supper at 6. She paused, looking Hannah over with motherly concern. Would you like a bath drawn, dear? You look like you've had a rough journey. Hannah almost wept at the kindness in the older woman's voice. Yes, please. That would be wonderful. While Mrs. Miller went to arrange the bath, Hannah sat on the edge of the bed, suddenly overwhelmed by all that had happened. In less than a week, her life had been completely upended, from the horror of being traded to Blackstone, to her desperate escape, to meeting Rylan and the dangerous journey to Tucson. Now she was here, alone in a strange town, with nothing but the clothes on her back and whatever future she could make for herself. The thought should have been terrifying, but instead, Hannah felt a curious sense of freedom. For the first time in years, she was truly independent, answerable to no one but herself. It was a daunting prospect, but also exhilarating. The bath, when it came, was blissful. Hannah soaked in the warm water, washing away days of dust and fear. Mrs. Miller had provided a clean nightgown and promised to help her find more suitable clothing in the morning. Clean and exhausted, Hannah fell into bed and into a deep, dreamless sleep. When she woke, the sun was high in the sky, and the sounds of the bustling town drifted through her open window. For a moment, she was disoriented. Then memory rushed back: Blackstone, Rylan, their flight across the desert. She dressed quickly in the simple dress Mrs. Miller had left for her, slightly too large, but clean and respectable, and went downstairs. The dining room was empty, the noon meal long over, but Mrs. Miller appeared from the kitchen with a plate of cold chicken, bread, and fruit. There you are, dear, she said warmly. Thought you might be hungry when you woke. Thank you, Hannah said gratefully, realizing she was, indeed, famished. You're very kind, Mrs. Miller sat across from her as she ate. Rylan told me a bit about your situation, she said gently. Not details. Mind you, that boy never was one for gossip. But he said you were in trouble and needed a fresh start. Hannah nodded, swallowing a bite of bread. That's true. I'm hoping to find work as a teacher, if possible. Mrs. Miller's face brightened. Well, now, that's providential. The school board just posted a notice yesterday looking for a teacher. The last one up and married a rancher from Bisbee and left town with hardly any notice. She patted Hannah's hand. You finish your meal, and I'll take you to speak with Mr. Jenkins at the general store. He's head of the school board. True to her word, Mrs. Miller escorted Hannah to Jenkins' general store after lunch. Mr. Jenkins, a tall, thin man with spectacles perched on his nose, listened attentively as Hannah explained her qualifications. We're desperate for a teacher, he admitted. Term starts in 3 weeks, and we have 28 children enrolled. He peered at her over his glasses. Can you handle a classroom of that size? Ages 6 to 14. Yes, sir, Hannah said confidently. I taught 32 students in Texas, all ages. Mr. Jenkins nodded, looking relieved. Well, then, Miss Morrison, I believe we can come to an arrangement. The position pays $30 a month, plus room and board in the small house behind the school. It was a fair offer, better than Hannah had expected. I accept, Mr. Jenkins. Thank you. They shook hands, and just like that, Hannah had secured her future, or at least the beginning of one. As she and Mrs. Miller walked back to the boarding house, Hannah felt a weight lift from her shoulders. She had work, would soon have a home of her own, and was far from Blackstone's reach. The only shadow on her newfound happiness was Rylan's absence. She hadn't seen him since he'd left her at Mrs. Miller's the day before, and she wondered when or if he would return before leaving on his cattle drive. "Has Rylan stopped by today?" she asked Mrs. Miller, trying to sound casual. The older woman gave her a knowing look. "Not yet, dear. But don't worry, that boy keeps his word. If he said he'd come, he will." Hannah spent the rest of the day helping Mrs. Miller around the boarding house and getting to know the town. Tucson was larger and more developed than she had expected, with several streets of businesses, a church, a small bank, and even a newspaper office. People of various backgrounds mingled on the boardwalks: Mexican families, American settlers, and the occasional Native American. As evening approached, Hannah found herself growing increasingly restless. She sat on the front porch of the boarding house, watching the street for any sign of Rylan. When Mrs. Miller called her in for supper, she went reluctantly, her disappointment a tight knot in her stomach. She was picking at her meal when the front door opened, and familiar footsteps sounded in the hallway. Hannah looked up, her heart leaping, as Rylan entered the dining room. He had bathed and changed clothes since she'd last seen him, wearing a clean shirt and his hair still damp. His eyes found hers immediately, and the smile that spread across his face made Hannah's breath catch. "I was beginning to think you'd forgotten about me," she said, unable to keep the relief from her voice. Rylan shook his head. "Not possible," he replied simply. Mrs. Miller bustled in from the kitchen. "Rylan Garrett, just in time for supper. Sit down, sit down." He took the chair across from Hannah, his eyes never leaving her face. "You look well," he said quietly. "Rested?" Hannah nodded. "Mrs. Miller has been very kind. And I have good news: I've been hired to teach at the town school." Rylan's face lit up with genuine pleasure. "That's wonderful, Hannah. Congratulations." As they ate, Hannah told him about her meeting with Mr. Jenkins and her exploration of the town. Rylan listened attentively, asking questions and offering insights about Tucson and its inhabitants. There was an ease between them now, a comfortable familiarity that belied the short time they'd known each other. After supper, Mrs. Miller shooed them out onto the porch, claiming she had dishes to wash, but giving them a wink that made Hannah blush. They sat side by side on the porch swing, watching as the town settled into evening, lanterns being lit in windows and stars appearing overhead. "When do you leave?" Hannah asked finally, the question that had been pressing on her mind all day. "Day after tomorrow," Rylan replied. "We'll be driving 2,000 head of cattle up to Santa Fe. It's a big contract." Hannah nodded, trying to hide her disappointment. "How long will you be gone?" 2 months, at least. Maybe 3. He turned to look at her directly. "I'll come back, Hannah." The promise in his voice made her heart race. "Will you?" "Yes." He took her hand, his fingers warm and calloused against hers. "If you want me to." Hannah met his gaze steadily. "I do." Something shifted in Rylan's expression, a softening that made him look younger, more vulnerable. He leaned closer, and Hannah's breath caught as she realized he was going to kiss her. His lips were gentle against hers, the contact brief but full of promise. When he pulled back, his eyes were dark with emotion. "I've been wanting to do that since the moment I pulled you onto my horse." Hannah smiled, reaching up to touch his cheek. "I'm glad you finally did." They talked long into the evening, making plans for when Rylan returned. He would come to Tucson after the cattle drive, find work nearby. They would court properly, get to know each other without the pressure of danger and flight. "It won't be easy," Rylan warned. "I've been on the move for years. Settling down doesn't come natural to me." "We'll figure it out together," Hannah assured him, believing it with all her heart. When it came time for Hannah to go inside, Rylan walked her to the door. He kissed her again, longer this time, his arms encircling her waist and drawing her close. Hannah returned the kiss with equal fervor, her heart full of hope for their future. "Good night, Hannah Morrison," Rylan said softly, reluctantly releasing her. "Good night, Rylan Garrett," she replied. "Until tomorrow." Hannah slept soundly that night, her dreams filled with images of Rylan and the life they might build together. She woke refreshed and eager for the day ahead, knowing she would see him again before he left on his cattle drive. But the day brought unexpected news. As Hannah sat at breakfast, a commotion in the street drew her to the window. A group of men on horseback had ridden into town, their clothes dusty from the trail. With a jolt of fear, Hannah recognized Silas Blackstone at their center, his burly form unmistakable even from a distance. Mrs. Miller joined her at the window. "Trouble?" she asked, her sharp eyes taking in Hannah's pale face. "The man who's after me," Hannah whispered. "He's found me." Mrs. Miller's expression hardened. "You stay right here, dear. I'll send my boy to fetch Rylan." Hannah paced the small parlor anxiously, peeking through the curtains to watch as Blackstone and his men dismounted in front of the sheriff's office. Her heart pounded with fear. What if Blackstone convinced the sheriff that she was his property? What if they took her away before Rylan could get here? She was on the verge of panic when the back door opened, and Rylan strode in, his face grim. "Mrs. Miller sent for me," he said, crossing the room to take Hannah's hands. "Are you all right?" Hannah nodded, relief flooding through her. "Yes, but Blackstone is here, talking to the sheriff." Rylan's jaw tightened. "I know. I saw them." He looked into her eyes. "Do you trust me, Hannah?" "With my life," she replied without hesitation. His expression softened momentarily. "Good. Because I have a plan, but it requires your complete trust." He glanced toward the front of the house. "They'll be coming here soon. Blackstone will claim you belong to him, that I stole you away." Hannah's fear returned. What if the sheriff believes him? "He won't," Rylan said confidently. "Not when he hears what I have to say." He squeezed her hands. "But I need to know, are you willing to take a chance? On me? On us?" Hannah looked up at this man who had risked everything to save her, who had shown her kindness and respect when others had treated her as property. The answer was simple. "Yes," she said firmly. "Yes, I am." Rylan's smile was brief but heartfelt. "Then follow my lead." They didn't have long to wait. Soon, heavy footsteps sounded on the porch, and a knock rattled the front door. Mrs. Miller answered it, her voice cool as she greeted the visitors. "Sheriff Daniels to see you. Miss Morrison," she called. Hannah took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and walked into the hallway with Rylan at her side. Sheriff Daniels stood in the doorway, a tall man with a weathered face and shrewd eyes. Behind him loomed Silas Blackstone, his expression triumphant when he spotted Hannah. "There she is," Blackstone exclaimed. "That's the woman who was stolen from me." The sheriff held up a hand for silence. "Miss Morrison," he said calmly, "this man claims you were purchased from your stepfather, and that Mr. Garrett here abducted you. What do you have to say to that?" Hannah lifted her chin defiantly. "My stepfather had no right to sell me to anyone, Sheriff. I am a free woman, not property to be traded. When Mr. Blackstone tried to force me to go with him, I ran. Mr. Garrett helped me escape." Blackstone's face reddened with anger. "I paid good money for her. Her pa made a deal, she belongs to me." "No woman belongs to any man," Rylan said quietly, stepping forward. "Not as property." The sheriff studied them thoughtfully. "The law's a bit murky on this, I'm afraid. If there was a contract of some kind." "There is another matter to consider, Sheriff," Rylan interrupted. "Miss Morrison and I were married yesterday by Reverend Porter. She is now my wife, and as such, is under my protection by law." Hannah's heart skipped a beat at Rylan's words. She had expected him to defend her, but not this way. Yet she didn't hesitate to play along, stepping closer to Rylan and letting him put his arm around her waist. "That's a lie," Blackstone sputtered. "Is it?" the sheriff asked, looking between Hannah and Rylan. "That true, Miss Morrison? Are you Mrs. Garrett now?" Hannah met his gaze steadily. "Yes, Sheriff. We were married yesterday." The sheriff nodded slowly. "Well, then, that settles it. A woman's husband has legal right to her, not some man who made a deal with her stepfather." He turned to Blackstone. "I suggest you move along, Mr. Blackstone. There's nothing for you here." Blackstone's face contorted with fury. "This isn't over," he growled, glaring at Rylan. "No one takes what's mine." "She was never yours," Rylan replied evenly. "And if you come near my wife again, you'll answer to me." There was something in Rylan's voice, a deadly calm that promised action rather than mere words, that made Blackstone step back. With a final glare, he stormed out, his heavy boots thumping on the porch steps. The sheriff watched him go, then turned back to Hannah and Rylan. "I'd like to see that marriage certificate," he said mildly. "Just to have everything official, you understand." Hannah felt a moment of panic, but Rylan remained composed. "Of course, Sheriff. We'll bring it by your office later today." After the sheriff left, Hannah turned to Rylan, her heart racing. "What now? We don't have a marriage certificate." Rylan took her hands in his. "We could," he said simply, "if you wanted." Hannah stared at him, uncertain if she understood his meaning. "Rylan, are you proposing to me?" "Not how I planned it," he admitted with a rueful smile. "I was going to court you proper after I got back from the cattle drive. But circumstances being what they are." He looked into her eyes, his expression serious. "I know it's fast, Hannah. We've only known each other a few days. But in that time, I've seen your courage, your strength, your kindness. I know in my heart there'll never be another woman for me." Hannah's breath caught. "Are you sure? This isn't just to protect me." Rylan shook his head. "Protecting you is part of it, yes. But it's more than that." He paused, seeming to search for words. "When I found you in the desert, running for your life, something changed in me. For years, I've been drifting, never staying anywhere long, never letting myself get close to anyone. But with you," his voice softened, "with you, I can see a future, a home." Tears pricked Hannah's eyes. In the short time she'd known him, Rylan Garrett had shown her more respect and care than any man in her life. He had risked himself to save her, had treated her with honor, had seen her as a person of value rather than a possession. And somewhere along their desperate journey, she had fallen in love with him, his quiet strength, his unwavering integrity, his gentle heart beneath the tough exterior. "Yes," she said, her voice strong despite her tears. "Yes, I'll marry you, Rylan Garrett." The smile that spread across his face was like sunrise breaking over the desert, warm and full of promise. He pulled her into his arms, kissing her with a tenderness that made her heart soar. Mrs. Miller, who had been hovering discreetly in the background, let out a delighted laugh. "Well, it seems we have a wedding to arrange. And quickly, if you're to satisfy Sheriff Daniels." They were married that afternoon in Tucson's small church, with Mrs. Miller and Mr. Jenkins as witnesses. Reverend Porter, understanding their unusual situation, agreed to backdate the certificate by 1 day. Hannah wore a borrowed dress of pale blue cotton, and Rylan had somehow found time to purchase a simple gold band from the jeweler on Main Street. As they stood before the Reverend, hands joined and hearts full, Hannah marveled at the strange and wonderful turn her life had taken. A week ago, she had been facing a life of servitude to a cruel man. Now she was marrying a man she had chosen, a man who valued her freedom as much as his own. "I, Rylan, take thee, Hannah, to be my lawfully wedded wife," he said, his voice steady and sure. "To have and to hold, from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part." When Hannah repeated the vows, her voice trembled with emotion, but her eyes never left Rylan's face. As Reverend Porter pronounced them man and wife, she felt a profound sense of rightness, as if the tumultuous events of the past week had been leading inevitably to this moment. The cattle drive could not be delayed, so their honeymoon consisted of 1 night in a small room above the town's best restaurant, courtesy of Mr. Jenkins and the other members of the school board, who were delighted that their new teacher would be remaining permanently in Tucson. In the privacy of their room, Rylan and Hannah came together as husband and wife, their union tender and passionate, a physical expression of the bond that had formed between them during their desperate flight across the desert. Afterward, as Hannah lay in Rylan's arms, listening to the steady rhythm of his heart, she felt a contentment she had never known before. "I can't believe how much has changed in a week," she murmured, tracing patterns on his chest. "From the worst day of my life to the best." Rylan kissed the top of her head. "The day I found you was the luckiest day of my life, even if I didn't know it then." The next morning came too soon. Hannah stood with Rylan at the edge of town, where the cattle herd was gathering, cowboys riding among the milling animals and shouting instructions. The trail boss, a grizzled man named Hank Dawson, had agreed to take on Rylan despite his last-minute marriage. "Just be back in Tucson when we're done," Dawson had said gruffly. Can't have a lovesick cowboy mooning over his new bride during the drive. Now, as the time for departure drew near, Hannah clung to Rylan's hands, memorizing the feel of them, the strength and gentleness that had saved her. 2 months, she said, trying to be brave. It's not so long. I'll be back before you know it, Rylan promised, his eyes conveying what words could not, that leaving her was the hardest thing he'd ever done, but that he would return, that their life together was just beginning. He kissed her one last time, a kiss full of promise and longing, then mounted his horse. Take care of yourself, Mrs. Garrett, he said, his smile warming her despite the ache of imminent separation. And you, Mr. Garrett, she replied. Come back to me. Always, he vowed, then turned his horse and rode toward the herd, his straight back and proud shoulders a sight Hannah knew she would recall in the lonely nights ahead. Hannah watched until the dust cloud raised by thousands of hooves obscured Rylan from view, then walked back to town, to the small house behind the school that would be their home when he returned. She had 2 months to prepare for their life together, to make the house a home, to establish herself as the town's teacher, to build a place for them in this community. The days passed in a blur of activity. Hannah threw herself into preparing the schoolhouse for the new term, cleaning and organizing, ordering books and supplies. The small house behind the school became a project as well. She scrubbed and mended, planted flowers in the front yard, and began collecting items to make it comfortable and welcoming for Rylan's return. The people of Tucson embraced her warmly, especially once they heard the story of her escape from Blackstone and her rescue by Rylan. Mrs. Miller remained a steadfast friend, often inviting Hannah to the boarding house for meals and companionship. Mr. Jenkins and the other members of the school board were pleased with her preparations for the term and assured her she would be a fine teacher for their children. At night, alone in the small house, Hannah would read by lamplight or write long letters to Rylan that she could not send but would give to him when he returned. Sometimes she would step outside and look up at the stars, wondering if Rylan was looking at the same stars from his camp on the trail, thinking of her as she thought of him. The school term began, and Hannah found joy in teaching again. The children of Tucson were bright and eager, if sometimes rambunctious, and she quickly developed a rapport with them. Teaching occupied her days and tired her enough that sleep came more easily at night, making the time pass more quickly as she waited for Rylan's return. 6 weeks into the term, Hannah was walking home from school when Sheriff Daniels approached her, his expression grave. Her heart stuttered with fear. Had something happened to Rylan? Mrs. Garrett, the sheriff said, touching the brim of his hat. Could I have a word? Of course, Sheriff, Hannah replied, trying to keep her voice steady. Is everything all right? Is it Rylan? No, madam, not as far as I know, he assured her quickly. It's about Silas Blackstone. He's been seen in the area again, asking questions about you and your husband. A chill ran through Hannah despite the warm afternoon. What kind of questions? Wanting to know when the cattle drive is due back. Whether you're alone in that house. The sheriff's eyes were kind but concerned. I don't think he's given up his claim on you, Mrs. Garrett. And men like that can be dangerous when they feel they've been cheated. Hannah nodded, fear a cold knot in her stomach. What should I do? I'll keep an eye on your place, Sheriff Daniels promised. And I've asked Mrs. Miller if you could stay at the boarding house until your husband returns. Safer there, with other people around. Hannah agreed, though she hated the thought of leaving the home she'd prepared for Rylan. That evening, she packed some clothes and moved temporarily to Mrs. Miller's, taking a room on the second floor with a view of the street. For several days, there was no sign of Blackstone, and Hannah began to hope that the sheriff's warning had been overly cautious. She continued teaching, dividing her time between the school and the boarding house, always alert but trying not to let fear control her life. Then, one evening as she graded papers in her room, a movement outside caught her eye. A figure stood in the shadows across the street, watching the boarding house. Even in the dim light, Hannah recognized the bulky silhouette of Silas Blackstone. Her hands trembling, she went downstairs to find Sheriff Daniels, who had come by to check on her. Together they watched from the window as Blackstone eventually moved away, disappearing down a side street. He's waiting for something, the sheriff said grimly, biding his time. Hannah knew with sick certainty what Blackstone was waiting for Rylan's return. He wanted revenge on both of them, and he was patient enough to wait for his opportunity. The next day, Hannah was teaching when a commotion outside drew the children to the windows. A rider had galloped into town, covered in dust, his horse lathered with sweat. He pulled up at the sheriff's office, shouting something Hannah couldn't make out. "Back to your seats, children," she said automatically, though her own heart was racing. Something was wrong, she could feel it. It wasn't until after school that she learned the news. The cattle drive had been attacked near the territorial border rustlers who had killed 2 cowboys and scattered the herd. The survivors had regrouped and continued on, but there were injuries among the men. Was Rylan Garrett among the injured? Hannah asked the deputy who brought her the news, her voice barely above a whisper. "The messenger didn't have names, madam," the young man replied apologetically. "Just said there were several hurt, some bad." Hannah spent the next week in an agony of uncertainty, jumping at every sound, hoping for word of Rylan. She continued teaching, the routine providing some solace, but her nights were sleepless, filled with worry and fear. Then, early one morning before school, Hannah heard hoofbeats on the street outside the boarding house. She rushed to the window, her heart in her throat, to see a group of riders approaching trail-worn men on tired horses, the advance party of the returning cattle drive. And at their center, tall and straight in the saddle despite obvious exhaustion, was Rylan. Hannah flew down the stairs and out onto the porch, heedless of her state of undress in only her nightgown and robe. Rylan spotted her immediately, his weary face lighting up with a smile that made her heart soar. He dismounted somewhat stiffly and walked toward her, removing his hat as he approached. Hannah didn't wait for him to reach the porch. She ran to him, throwing herself into his arms with a cry of joy. Rylan caught her, holding her tightly despite what she now saw was a bandaged shoulder beneath his shirt. "You're hurt," she gasped, drawing back to look at him. Rylan shook his head, his eyes never leaving her face. "It's nothing, just a graze." He touched her cheek gently, as if assuring himself she was real. "I missed you, Hannah. Every day, every hour." "I missed you too," she whispered, tears of relief and happiness spilling down her cheeks. "I was so worried when we heard about the attack." Rylan's expression darkened. "It was bad. We lost Tom Fletcher and young Charlie Miles. But we got most of the herd through." His eyes softened as they looked at her. "All I could think about was getting back to you." They stood there in the middle of the street, oblivious to the smiles and knowing looks of the other cowboys and the townspeople who had come out to witness the reunion. Finally, Mrs. Miller called from the porch. "Bring that man inside, Hannah. He looks like he could use a hot meal and a proper bath." Hannah laughed, suddenly aware of their public display. She took Rylan's hand and led him toward the boarding house, her heart so full she thought it might burst. Later, after Rylan had bathed and eaten, they sat together on the bed in Hannah's small room, talking quietly. Hannah told him about the school, the house she had prepared for them, and reluctantly about Blackstone's return. Rylan's face hardened at the mention of Blackstone. "Where is he now?" "No one knows for sure," Hannah said. "He appears and disappears. The sheriff thinks he's waiting for you to return." Rylan nodded grimly. "Then we'll deal with him, once and for all." He took Hannah's hands in his. "But first, I want to see our home." They walked hand in hand to the small house behind the school, Hannah watching Rylan's face anxiously as he took in the neat yard with its newly planted flowers, the fresh paint on the shutters, the curtains visible through spotless windows. Inside, Rylan moved slowly from room to room, the cozy parlor with its comfortable chairs and small bookshelf, the kitchen with copper pots hanging from hooks, the bedroom with its handmade quilt and pressed curtains. In each space, Hannah had created warmth and comfort, a true home for them to share. "It's perfect," Rylan said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "Everything I never knew I wanted." Hannah felt a rush of pleasure at his words. "I wanted it to be ready for you, for us. A place to build our life together." Rylan pulled her into his arms, kissing her with a tenderness that made her heart ache. "I love you, Hannah Garrett," he murmured against her lips. "I think I have since the moment I first saw you, running across the desert like your life depended on it." "It did," Hannah whispered. "And you saved it." She looked up at him, her eyes shining with love and gratitude. "I love you, Rylan, more than I can say." They spent the afternoon in their new home, reconnecting after their long separation, sharing stories and dreams for their future. As the sun began to set, Rylan reluctantly suggested they return to the boarding house for the night. "It's safer there," he explained, his expression serious. "Until we deal with Blackstone, I don't want you alone here, especially after dark." Hannah nodded, understanding his concern. They gathered a few things and headed back toward town, walking close together in the gathering twilight. They had almost reached Main Street when a figure stepped out from between two buildings, blocking their path. Silas Blackstone stood before them, a pistol in his hand and hatred in his eyes. Well, he said, his voice slurred with drink. The happy couple returns. Rylan pushed Hannah slightly behind him, his body tense but his voice calm. "Stand aside, Blackstone. This ends now." Blackstone laughed, an ugly sound. "Oh, it ends all right. With you dead and her coming with me, like she should have from the start." He raised the pistol, aiming it at Rylan's chest. "You stole what was mine. Now you'll pay for it." Hannah's heart pounded with terror, but she stepped forward to stand beside Rylan. "I was never yours," she said clearly. "Never. I am Rylan Garrett's wife by choice and by law. And if you harm him, you'll have to kill me too." Blackstone's face contorted with rage. "Shut up, woman. You don't get a say in this." "Actually, she does," came a new voice from behind Blackstone. Sheriff Daniels stood there, his own pistol drawn and steady. "Drop the gun, Blackstone. It's over." For a moment, Hannah thought Blackstone would comply. His hand wavered, and uncertainty flashed across his face. Then, with a roar of defiance, he swung the pistol toward Hannah. The sound of gunfire cracked through the evening air. Blackstone stumbled backward, a look of surprise on his face, then fell heavily to the ground. The sheriff's bullet had found its mark, but not before Rylan had also drawn and fired, his shot hitting Blackstone a split second after the sheriff's. Hannah stood frozen, staring at the man who had caused so much fear and suffering, now still on the dusty street. Rylan's arm came around her, pulling her close, turning her face away from the sight. "It's over," he murmured into her hair. "It's really over now." The sheriff approached, holstering his pistol. "You both all right?" Rylan nodded, still holding Hannah protectively. "Yes. Thank you, Sheriff." "No thanks needed," Sheriff Daniels replied. "Been waiting for an excuse to deal with that one. He's caused nothing but trouble since he showed up." He looked at Hannah kindly. "He can't hurt you anymore, Mrs. Garrett." As a small crowd began to gather, drawn by the sound of gunfire, the sheriff took charge, directing two men to remove Blackstone's body and dispersing the onlookers with firm authority. Rylan led Hannah back to the boarding house, where Mrs. Miller took one look at her pale face and immediately said about brewing strong tea laced with whiskey. That night, as they lay together in the narrow bed in Hannah's boarding house room, Rylan held her close, his heartbeat steady beneath her cheek. "Tomorrow," he said softly, "we'll go home. To our home." Hannah nodded against his chest, the fear and tension of the day gradually giving way to a profound sense of peace. Blackstone was gone, the threat he represented eliminated. She and Rylan were free to begin their life together without the shadow of fear hanging over them. "What will you do now?" she asked, running her fingers along his arm. "Will you go back to driving cattle?" Rylan was quiet for a moment, considering. "No," he said finally. "I've had enough of the trail. It's time to put down roots." He kissed the top of her head. "Hank Dawson offered me a job as his foreman on a ranch he's buying outside town. Good pay, steady work. And I'd be home every night." Hannah lifted her head to look at him, her heart full. "You do that? Give up the life you've known?" Rylan's eyes were serious as they met hers. "For you? For us?" "Yes, Hannah." Without hesitation, he traced the line of her jaw with gentle fingers. "I've been wandering most of my life. Now I've found where I belong." The next morning, they walked back to their little house hand in hand, ready to begin their life together. The schoolchildren had heard about the confrontation with Blackstone, and several of them ran up to greet Hannah and meet her husband, their eyes wide with excitement as they looked at Rylan, already building him into a hero in their imaginations. Rylan accepted their attention with good grace, answering their eager questions about the cattle drive and his adventures on the trail. Hannah watched him, her heart swelling with love as she saw the kindness with which he treated the children, the patience he showed in satisfying their curiosity. As the children finally dispersed, called home by parents or drawn away by other interests, Rylan took Hannah's hand again, leading her toward their house. "I can see why you love teaching," he said. "Those kids adore you." Hannah smiled, squeezing his hand. "They'll adore you too, once they get to know you. The fearless cowboy who rescued the schoolteacher from a villain." Rylan chuckled. "Is that how they see it?" "It's how I see it," Hannah replied softly. At their doorstep, Rylan surprised her by sweeping her into his arms. "Tradition," he explained with a grin, carrying her across the threshold. A husband should carry his bride into their home. Inside, he set her gently on her feet, but kept his arms around her. "Welcome home, Mrs. Garrett," he said, his voice deep with emotion. Hannah reached up to touch his face, marveling at how this man, once a stranger who had appeared like a miracle when she needed him most, had become the center of her world. "Welcome home, Mr. Garrett," she replied, her voice catching. "Welcome home." In the days and weeks that followed, they settled into a rhythm of life together. Rylan began work at Dawson's ranch, coming home each evening to tell Hannah about his day while she prepared supper. Hannah continued teaching, her classes growing as word spread about the quality of instruction at Tucson School. Together, they became part of the community, attending church services on Sundays, joining in town celebrations, making friends with their neighbors. Spring turned to summer, and summer to fall. As the first anniversary of their hasty wedding approached, Rylan surprised Hannah one evening with a small velvet box. "What's this?" she asked, opening it to find a delicate gold ring set with a small diamond. "A proper engagement ring," Rylan explained, taking her hand. "We did everything backward, you and I. Met, married, and fell in love in that order." He smiled, the smile that still made her heart skip a beat. "I thought you deserved a proper proposal, even if it's a year late." He knelt before her, still holding her hand. "Hannah Morrison Garrett, I love you more than I ever thought possible. Will you do me the honor of remaining my wife for the rest of our days?" Tears of happiness filled Hannah's eyes as she nodded. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." Rylan slipped the ring onto her finger, then stood and pulled her into his arms, kissing her with all the love and passion that had grown between them over the past year. That winter brought news that filled their home with joy. Hannah was expecting a baby. Rylan's face, when she told him, was a study in wonder and delight. He lifted her in a gentle embrace, spinning her around the kitchen before setting her carefully on her feet again. "A baby," he said, his hand resting reverently on her still flat stomach. "Our baby." The months of pregnancy passed in a blur of preparation and anticipation. Rylan built a cradle with his own hands, working on it in the evenings by lamplight. Hannah sewed tiny garments and blankets, daydreaming about the child that would soon join their family. The baby, a boy they named Thomas after Rylan's father, was born on a crisp autumn morning, with Mrs. Miller serving as midwife and Rylan pacing anxiously outside the bedroom door until his son's first cry rang out. When he was finally allowed in, the sight of Hannah holding their child, tired but radiant, brought tears to his eyes. "He's perfect," Rylan whispered, sitting beside her on the bed and gently touching his son's tiny hand. "Perfect, like his mother." As Thomas grew from infant to toddler, their happiness only deepened. Rylan proved to be a natural father, patient and loving, delighting in his son's every achievement. Hannah continued teaching until their family expanded again with the birth of a daughter, Elizabeth, named after Hannah's mother. After Elizabeth's birth, Hannah decided to stay home with the children, at least until they were old enough for school. Tucson grew and prospered around them, changing from a frontier town to a thriving community. Rylan eventually bought a small ranch of his own outside town, where they moved when the children were older. The house was larger than their first home, but Hannah made sure it had the same warmth and love that had filled the little house behind the school. Life was not without challenges. Drought years when the ranch struggled, childhood illnesses that brought sleepless nights and worry, the normal conflicts and compromises of any marriage. But through it all, Rylan and Hannah faced each obstacle together, their bond only strengthening with time. Years passed, and their children grew. Thomas, tall and serious like his father, showed an aptitude for ranching and a love of the land. Elizabeth, with her mother's auburn hair and determined spirit, displayed a keen intelligence and a gift for teaching. Both children knew the story of how their parents had met, how their father had rescued their mother from a dangerous man, putting her on his horse and riding to safety. It's like a fairy tale, Elizabeth would say, her eyes wide with wonder. No, sweetheart, Hannah would correct her gently. It's better than a fairy tale, because it's true. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Rylan took Hannah for a ride, just the two of them, to a place in the desert where saguaro cacti stood like sentinels against the sky. As they sat on a blanket, sharing a simple picnic and watching the sunset paint the landscape in gold and crimson, Rylan took her hand, his thumb brushing over the two rings she wore, the simple band from their hasty wedding and the diamond he had given her a year later. 20 years, he said wonderingly. Sometimes it feels like yesterday that I found you running across the desert. And sometimes it feels like I've loved you forever. Hannah leaned against him, her head on his shoulder. At 42, her hair had threads of silver among the auburn, and fine lines marked the corners of her eyes. Rylan, nearing 50, had more gray than dark in his hair now, and the lines on his face had deepened. But when he looked at her, she still saw the same love and devotion that had been there from the beginning. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked, knowing the answer but wanting to hear it anyway. "Stopping that day? Taking on my troubles as your own?" Rylan turned to her, his gray eyes as clear and direct as they had been the day they met. "Not for a single moment," he said firmly. "Finding you was the best thing that ever happened to me, Hannah. You, our children, the life we've built together, it's more than I ever dreamed possible." He kissed her then, a kiss that held 2 decades of shared joys and sorrows, of passion and tenderness, of the deep, abiding love that had grown between them since that fateful day when she ran from danger and he put her on his horse and kept riding straight into a future brighter than either of them could have imagined. As they rode home in the gathering twilight, Hannah's heart was full. From the moment of desperate flight that had brought them together to this peaceful evening 20 years later, their journey had been one of courage and commitment, of choosing love over fear, of building something beautiful and lasting from the chaos of chance and circumstance. And as their home came into view, lights glowing in the windows and their grown children waiting to celebrate with them, Hannah knew with absolute certainty that the best chapters of their story were still being written, day by day, in the life they continued to create together.